My name is Daniel Voss, and I need to tell this exactly as it happened, because I am still not sure I believe it myself. It was late October, a Friday night, and I was driving home from my brother's place outside Logansport on a stretch of road called Route 9, a narrow two-lane highway that cuts through cornfields and patches of dense woods for almost 30 miles before it meets the interstate. I had made the drive 100 times before. I knew every curve, every dip, every place where the corn grew so tall it swallowed the headlights whole. I was tired, the radio was playing something low and forgettable, and I had no reason to expect that this particular night would be any different from the others. I was wrong. The clock on my dashboard read 11:40 when I first noticed the fog rolling in off the fields, thin at first, then thickening fast until my headlights barely cut 10 feet ahead of the hood. I slowed down, the way anyone would, gripping the wheel a little tighter, leaning forward slightly as though that would somehow help me see through the gray wall ahead. The road out here had no streetlights, no shoulders to speak of, just a narrow ribbon of cracked asphalt running between drainage ditches and walls of dead cornstalks. I had driven through fog before. Indiana nights in late October get like that sometimes, the cold air settling over warm ground. I told myself it was nothing. I kept driving. It was somewhere past the old Cutter Bridge, a narrow one-lane crossing over a creek that had been dry for years, that I first saw her. She was standing on the shoulder of the road, facing away from me, wearing a long white dress that looked almost luminous in my headlights, the fabric hanging still and heavy despite the wind that had been pushing through the cornfields all night. I slowed instinctively, my foot easing off the gas, my mind already constructing the ordinary explanation. A woman whose car had broken down, someone who needed help on a lonely stretch of road. I had no reason yet to feel the cold drop in my stomach that came a moment later, when I realized she had not moved at all, not even a fraction, the entire time my headlights had been on her. I brought my car to a slow stop about 30 feet from where she stood, my headlights washing over her pale form, the white dress hanging motionless around her ankles despite the breeze that bent the cornstalks on either side of the road. I rolled my window down a few inches, the cold night air rushing in, and called out to ask if she needed help. She did not turn. She did not speak. She simply stood there, facing the dark field beyond the ditch, her dark hair hanging loose and unmoving down her back. I sat there for a long moment, my hands tightening on the wheel, every instinct in my body telling me that something about this was deeply, fundamentally wrong, though I could not yet say exactly what. I almost drove away then. I want that on record because it matters later. Some part of me, some old animal instinct buried deep beneath the layers of politeness and concern that usually govern how I treat strangers, was screaming at me to put the car back in gear and leave her standing there in the fog. But I did not listen to it. I told myself I would feel guilty for the rest of my life if I drove past a woman who needed help and something happened to her. So I put the car in park, left the engine running, and stepped out onto the cracked asphalt of Route 9, the fog curling cold and wet around my ankles as I walked slowly toward her. My footsteps sounded too loud against the silence of the road, the only other sound the low idle of my engine behind me. I called out again as I approached, asking if she was all right, if she needed a ride somewhere. She still did not turn, but as I drew closer, I noticed something that made the hair on my arms stand on end. The white dress she wore was old-fashioned, the kind of high-collared, long-sleeved garment I had only ever seen in photographs from the early 1900s, and it was spotless, untouched by the mud and gravel of the roadside despite the dampness of the night. I stopped walking when I was perhaps 10 feet away from her, suddenly far less certain that approaching had been the right decision. I stood there in the fog, my heart beginning to pound harder than the situation seemed to warrant, and asked one more time if she could hear me. This time, slowly, she turned her head toward me, not her whole body, just her head, in a motion that seemed to take far too long, as though her neck were moving through something thicker than air. When her face finally came into view in the dim glow of my headlights, I felt my breath catch painfully in my chest. Her skin was pale, almost gray, stretched tight over features that might once have been beautiful. But it was her eyes that made my legs lock in place, refusing to carry me forward or backward. Where her eyes should have been, there was only black, an absolute and depthless black that seemed to swallow the headlight beams rather than reflect them. I do not know how long I stood there, frozen, staring into those impossible black eyes. It felt like minutes, though it could not have been more than a few seconds. She did not smile. She did not frown. Her expression remained utterly still, almost serene, which somehow made it worse than any look of malice could have been. Then, slowly, her lips parted, and a sound came out that was not quite a voice, low and dry, like wind moving through dead leaves, forming words I could not quite make out. I took a step backward without deciding to, my body acting on instinct alone, and that small movement seemed to break whatever stillness had been holding her in place. She took a step toward me. That single step was enough to shatter my paralysis completely. I turned and ran for my car, my shoes slipping on the wet gravel of the shoulder, my breath coming in short, ragged bursts. I did not look back. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and locked it with a shaking hand before jamming the car into gear and pulling away from the shoulder so fast that my tires spun briefly against the wet asphalt before catching. I did not slow down until I had put what felt like a mile between myself and that spot on the road, my eyes flicking constantly to the rearview mirror, though the thick fog made it impossible to see anything behind me beyond the faint red glow of my own taillights reflecting back. I told myself as I drove that I had imagined the eyes, that the strange lighting and the fog and my own exhaustion had conspired to make an ordinary, perhaps disturbed, woman look like something out of a nightmare. I have always been a practical man, an engineer by trade, someone who deals in facts and measurements rather than ghost stories. I tried to apply that same practicality now, breathing slowly, forcing my hands to relax their death grip on the steering wheel. I was perhaps 2 miles further down Route 9, my heart finally beginning to slow, when my headlights swept across the road ahead and found her standing on the shoulder again, in the exact same pose, facing away from me, as though she had never moved at all. I slammed on the brakes so hard that the car fishtailed slightly before coming to a stop in the middle of the empty road, my headlights illuminating her motionless white form perhaps 50 feet ahead. My mind reeled, trying to find some rational explanation. Perhaps there were 2 women, sisters in matching old-fashioned dresses, playing some elaborate and cruel prank on late-night drivers. Perhaps I had somehow doubled back without realizing it, lost in the fog and my own panic. But I knew, even as I tried to construct these explanations, that none of them felt true. I sat there in the idling car, staring at her through the windshield, and for the first time that night I felt something colder than fear settle into my chest. I felt certainty. I do not know what made me reach for my phone, except perhaps the desperate human instinct to connect with someone, anyone, who might be able to tell me I was not losing my mind. I fumbled it out of the cup holder and pressed the button to wake the screen, and found nothing but a black rectangle staring back at me, completely dead, though I had charged it fully before leaving my brother's house only an hour before. I tried the car's dashboard clock next, some absurd need to anchor myself in time, and found that it too had gone dark, the small green numbers that had been glowing steadily all night now replaced by nothing at all. The engine, at least, was still running. I held on to that small fact like a lifeline. I made a decision then that I have replayed countless times since, wondering if a different choice might have changed everything that followed. I decided to turn the car around. There was a wide gravel pull-off perhaps a quarter-mile behind me, used by farmers accessing the fields, and I thought if I could just reach it, I could turn around and head back the way I had come, toward my brother's house, toward people, toward lights and warmth and anything other than this empty fog-choked road and the impossible woman standing on its shoulder. I put the car in reverse, twisting in my seat to look through the back window as I backed slowly toward the pull-off, my headlights still fixed forward, still illuminating her unmoving white shape in the distance. I had backed perhaps 100 feet when I felt the car shudder beneath me, the engine note changing subtly, a faint stutter in its steady idle that made my stomach drop. I pressed the accelerator and felt the car respond sluggishly, far slower than it should have. I glanced at the dashboard, hoping to see some warning light, some explanation I could understand, but the entire panel remained dark and lifeless, no gauges, no indicators, nothing but black glass reflecting the fog drifting past my windows. The car continued to slow despite my foot pressing harder against the pedal, and within another 50 feet it rolled gently to a stop in the middle of the empty road, the engine still running but the wheels no longer responding to anything I tried. I sat there in the stalled car, my breath fogging faintly in air that had grown noticeably colder inside the cabin than it had been only minutes before. I checked the rearview mirror, and my chest tightened painfully when I saw the road behind me was empty, the woman no longer visible in the direction I had last seen her. I told myself this was good news, that perhaps whatever strange spell had gripped the night was finally lifting. Then I looked forward through the windshield, and found her standing directly in front of my car, close enough now that I could see the fine details of her dress, the small embroidered buttons running up its high collar, the way the black depths of her eyes seemed to pull at the edges of my vision. I do not remember deciding to scream, but I heard the sound tear out of my own throat as I scrambled backward in my seat, as far from the windshield as the confines of the car would allow. She did not move closer immediately. She simply stood there, perhaps 15 feet from my front bumper, her head tilted slightly to one side in a gesture that might have been curiosity on anyone else, but on her felt like something far more predatory. I fumbled for the door handle on instinct, some animal part of my brain insisting that I needed to run, needed to put distance between myself and whatever this thing was, before my more rational mind could intervene and remind me that I had no idea where I would even run to. I forced myself to stay inside the car, gripping the steering wheel with both hands as though it could somehow anchor me to safety. I tried the ignition, pumping the gas pedal uselessly, the engine continuing its steady idle without ever translating into actual movement. The woman remained where she was, watching, if watching was even the right word for whatever those black eyes were doing. I noticed, in the strange clarity that sometimes comes with extreme fear, that despite the cold and the damp fog rolling across the road, her dress remained completely dry, completely still, as though she existed somehow apart from the physical conditions surrounding her. The thought did nothing to comfort me. If anything, it confirmed every fear I had been desperately trying to talk myself out of. Minutes passed, though it felt like much longer, the two of us locked in a silent standoff in the middle of an empty Indiana road. I tried my phone again, pressing the power button repeatedly, and felt a small surge of hope when the screen flickered briefly to life before dying again almost immediately, as though something were actively draining whatever charge remained. In that brief flicker, I caught a glimpse of the time displayed on the lock screen, and felt a fresh wave of dread wash over me. It read 11:40, the exact same time it had been when I first saw her standing on the shoulder of the road, though by my own internal sense of time, at least half an hour had passed since then. I decided I could not simply sit there and wait for whatever was going to happen next. I gathered what courage I could and reached for the door handle, intending to step out and try to flee on foot toward the pull-off I had spotted earlier, hoping that perhaps whatever bound her to the road itself might not extend to the open fields beyond it. The moment my fingers touched the handle, the woman's head snapped toward me with a speed that contradicted every slow, deliberate movement she had made before, and a sound rose from her, the same dry, rustling, almost voice I had heard before, except now it came not as a single low murmur but as something closer to a shriek, high and grating, tearing through the fog like nails dragged across stone. I yanked my hand back from the door handle as though it had burned me, my whole body trembling now, tears of pure terror starting to blur my vision. The shrieking sound cut off as abruptly as it had begun, and the woman returned to her former stillness, though something in her posture now felt different, more coiled, more ready, like a predator that had briefly shown its teeth before settling back to wait. I forced myself to think, to remember anything I had ever heard about this stretch of road, any local stories or warnings that might offer some clue about what I was facing. A memory surfaced slowly, something my brother had mentioned once in passing, about an old story tied to Route 9 and a bridge a few miles back, something about a bride who never made it to her wedding. I could not remember the details clearly, only fragments, something about a young woman in the early 1900s who had been found dead on this very road, still dressed in her wedding gown, her eyes said to have been removed entirely before her body was discovered, though no one had ever determined how or why. I had dismissed it at the time as nothing more than a local legend, the kind of story small towns invent to explain dark stretches of empty road. Sitting in my stalled car with that same impossible figure standing motionless before my headlights, I found myself desperately wishing I had paid closer attention, had asked more questions, had learned whether there was any way to survive an encounter like the one I now found myself trapped inside. I tried the ignition one more time, more out of desperation than any real hope, and to my genuine shock, the engine responded, the idle smoothing out and the dashboard flickering back to life with a soft electronic chime. I did not waste a single second questioning my good fortune. I threw the car into reverse and pressed the accelerator hard, the tires spinning briefly against the damp asphalt before gripping and sending the car lurching backward at a speed that felt reckless even in my panic. I twisted in my seat to watch through the rear window, steering by feel as much as sight, and watched the woman's white shape recede into the fog ahead of my windshield, smaller and smaller, until the gray mist swallowed her completely. I reached the gravel pull-off and spun the wheel hard, the car sliding slightly on the loose stone before I managed to bring it around to face the opposite direction, back the way I had originally come from my brother's house. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep them steady on the wheel, but I pressed the accelerator down and felt the car surge forward, the headlights cutting through the fog as I retraced the road at a speed I would never normally have risked on these narrow curves. I passed the spot where I had first seen her, the shoulder now empty, nothing but drifting fog and dead cornstalks bending gently in a wind I could not feel inside the closed car. I allowed myself a single shaky breath of relief as the familiar shape of the old Cutter Bridge came into view ahead, its narrow steel frame barely visible through the fog. Crossing it would put me less than 10 miles from my brother's driveway, from lights and people and the comforting ordinariness of a world that made sense. I pressed the accelerator harder, eager to put the bridge and everything beyond it behind me as quickly as possible. As my headlights swept across the bridge's entrance, they caught on a pale shape standing directly in the center of the narrow span, white dress hanging motionless, dark hair framing a face I now knew far too well, blocking the only way across. I slammed on the brakes again, the car skidding several feet before coming to a stop just short of the bridge, close enough now that I could see her clearly despite the fog, close enough to see that her black eyes were fixed directly on me, unblinking, patient, as though she had known all along exactly where I would try to run. I sat there gasping, my mind racing through every possible alternative. The bridge was the only crossing for miles in either direction, the creek beneath it running through a ravine too steep for the car to navigate. I was beginning to understand, with a dawning horror that settled cold and heavy in my chest, that this might not be a road I could simply drive away from. I made the decision to get out of the car. It went against every survival instinct I possessed, but some desperate logic insisted that if she was tethered to the bridge itself, to this specific crossing, then perhaps I could find another way around on foot, through the fields, circling back to the road on the far side of the ravine. I stepped out into the cold night air, my legs unsteady beneath me, and immediately regretted the decision as the fog seemed to thicken around me, swallowing the sound of my own footsteps, swallowing even the glow of my headlights until I could see no more than a few feet in any direction. I pressed forward anyway, angling toward where I believed the field began, my hand trailing along the cold metal of the car as long as I could keep contact with it. The moment my hand left the car, the fog around me seemed to close in completely, a wall of gray so dense I could no longer see my own feet on the ground beneath me. I stumbled forward several steps, calling out uselessly into the silence, my voice swallowed by the mist as thoroughly as everything else. Somewhere ahead of me, faint but unmistakable, I heard that same dry rustling almost voice, forming words I still could not understand, though something in the rhythm of them now felt less like nonsense and more like a language I simply did not know. I froze in place, terrified to move further into the fog, equally terrified to try retracing my steps back to a car I could no longer see or hear. I do not know how long I stood there, lost in that impossible fog, before I caught the faint red glow of my own taillights somewhere behind me, barely visible through the thinning gray. I moved toward it as quickly as I dared, my arms outstretched, and felt a flood of relief when my fingers finally found the cold metal of my car's rear bumper. I worked my way around to the driver's side and climbed back in, locking the doors with hands that would not stop shaking. Through the windshield, the fog had cleared just enough to show me the bridge again, and the woman still standing at its center, though now, impossibly, she seemed slightly closer to the near end than she had been before. I sat in the locked car, trying desperately to think of any other option. The fields were clearly not a viable path, not with that fog swallowing everything beyond arm's reach. The bridge remained blocked. Behind me, the road stretched back the way I had come, toward that first spot where I had encountered her, and I had no reason to believe driving in that direction would lead anywhere except back into the same trap, looping endlessly through fog and darkness with no true escape at either end. I checked my phone again, more out of habit than hope, and found it just as dead as before, the screen refusing even the brief flicker it had managed earlier. I noticed, as I sat there turning over my dwindling options, that the fuel gauge on my dashboard had begun creeping downward at a rate that made no sense, the needle visibly dropping even as I watched it, far faster than any amount of idling could explain. I felt a fresh wave of panic rise in my chest. If the car ran out of gas, I would have no choice but to face whatever was out there on foot, with no shelter, no light beyond what feeble illumination my dying phone might occasionally offer. I made a decision, reckless as it felt, to try driving straight through, to gun the engine and cross the bridge regardless of what stood in the way, trusting that the car itself might offer some protection that walking would not. I pressed the accelerator hard, the engine roaring as the car surged forward toward the bridge, toward the pale, unmoving figure still standing at its center. I told myself I would not stop, that I would not slow down no matter what my instincts screamed at me to do, that the only way through this nightmare was forward, fast, and without hesitation. The headlights swept across her as I closed the distance, and for one terrible instant I saw her face turn fully toward me, her black eyes catching the light in a way that seemed to drink it rather than reflect it, her mouth opening wider than should have been possible, and then my car passed through the space where she had been standing, finding nothing there at all. I crossed the bridge in a blur, the old steel structure rattling beneath my tires, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. I did not slow down on the far side, pushing the car faster down the dark road, my eyes flicking constantly between the windshield ahead and the rearview mirror behind, half expecting to see her standing in the road behind me, white dress glowing in my taillights. The road behind me remained empty, nothing but drifting fog and darkness, and for the first time since this nightmare had begun, I allowed myself to believe that I might actually escape it. I did not yet understand how wrong that belief would prove to be. I drove for what felt like several miles, the fog finally beginning to thin around me, the familiar shapes of farmhouses and silos starting to emerge from the darkness on either side of the road, landmarks I recognized from countless ordinary drives along this same route. My breathing slowly began to steady, my hands loosening their white-knuckled grip on the wheel. I even allowed myself a short, disbelieving laugh, the kind that comes after surviving something the rational mind still cannot fully process. I reached for the radio, desperate for some ordinary sound to fill the silence, and the moment my fingers touched the dial, every light on my dashboard died at once, plunging the cabin into total darkness despite the engine continuing to run smoothly beneath me. I did not stop the car this time. I gripped the wheel and kept my foot steady on the accelerator, refusing to give in to the fear clawing its way up my throat, trusting the dim outline of the road ahead, barely visible now that my headlights too had dimmed to almost nothing. I caught movement in my peripheral vision, something pale shifting in the dead grass along the shoulder, keeping pace with the car despite my speed, never quite resolving into a clear shape no matter how hard I tried to focus on it. I forced my eyes forward, refusing to look directly at whatever was running alongside me in the dark, some instinct warning me that looking would only make things worse. The pale shape along the shoulder eventually fell away, and my headlights flickered back to something close to normal brightness, illuminating the road ahead clearly enough that I finally recognized the turn that would lead me onto the county highway, away from Route 9 entirely, toward the interstate and the wider, safer world beyond it. I took the turn faster than I should have, the tires squealing slightly against the asphalt, and felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in what felt like hours, though the dashboard clock, now functioning again, insisted barely 20 minutes had passed since I first saw her standing on the shoulder of the road. I kept driving, faster than the speed limit allowed, putting as much distance as possible between myself and Route 9, watching my mirrors obsessively for any sign that I was still being followed. The county highway was wider, better lit in places, with the occasional passing car offering small, fragile reassurances that I had returned to something resembling the normal world. I began to consider, cautiously, hopefully, that perhaps whatever bound her had been tied entirely to that specific stretch of road, that crossing onto different asphalt had somehow severed whatever connection she had been trying to forge between us. I wanted desperately to believe that. I needed to believe it, if I was going to survive the remaining drive to my brother's house with my sanity intact. I reached the on-ramp for the interstate roughly 15 minutes later, merging into the sparse but blessedly normal late-night traffic, surrounded now by the steady hum of other engines, the distant glow of a truck stop visible on the horizon ahead. I felt something in my shoulders finally begin to unknot, the tension that had gripped me since that first impossible sighting slowly loosening its hold. I even reached for my phone again, more out of habit than expectation, and found the screen lighting up normally this time, full battery, current time, no missed calls or messages, nothing out of the ordinary at all. I allowed myself, finally, to believe that whatever I had encountered on Route 9 had been left behind on that lonely fog-choked stretch of road. I took the exit from my brother's town roughly 20 minutes later, the familiar lights of gas stations and fast food signs a welcome and almost overwhelming relief after the darkness I had just escaped. I considered, briefly, simply driving straight home instead of stopping at my brother's, but exhaustion and the lingering tremor in my hands convinced me I needed somewhere safe to land before continuing any further that night. I pulled into his driveway with a relief so profound it brought unexpected tears to my eyes, the porch light glowing warm and steady ahead of me, every ordinary detail of the house suddenly precious in a way it had never been before. I sat in the driveway for a long moment after putting the car in park, simply breathing, letting the reality of the ordinary world settle back around me. I thought about going inside immediately, waking my brother, telling him everything that had happened, but some instinct made me pause first, made me want a moment alone to collect myself before trying to put any of it into words. I reached up to adjust the rearview mirror, intending to check my own reflection, to confirm to myself that I still looked like an ordinary, sane man despite everything I had just survived. What I saw in that mirror instead stopped my breath completely in my chest. The mirror, angled now toward the back seat instead of the road behind me, showed nothing at first glance, just the dim shapes of the empty seats and the window beyond them, lit faintly by the porch light spilling in from outside. I almost looked away, almost convinced myself I had imagined the flicker of white at the very edge of the glass. Then I forced myself to look again, more carefully this time, and felt every drop of relief I had spent the last hour building drain out of me at once. She was sitting in the back seat, directly behind me, her white dress spread out across the leather in folds that caught the porch light with an unnatural, pale glow. Her hands rested folded in her lap, perfectly still, exactly as still as she had been standing on the shoulder of Route 9 what felt like a lifetime ago. I did not turn around. I could not make myself turn around. I stared instead into the small rectangle of the mirror, watching her reflection, watching as slowly, deliberately, her head began to tilt upward, bringing those depthless black eyes into view, fixed directly on mine through the glass. My hand found the door handle before my mind had fully processed the decision to move, some primal instinct overriding the paralysis that gripped the rest of my body. I shoved the door open and threw myself out of the car, stumbling onto the gravel of my brother's driveway, scrambling backward on my hands until I had put several yards of open space between myself and the vehicle. I did not look away from the car the entire time, watching the back seat through the open driver's door, half expecting her to emerge, to step out onto the gravel after me with that same slow, deliberate certainty she had shown on the road. She did not emerge. Through the open door, I could see the back seat clearly now in the spill of the porch light, and it was, impossibly, completely empty, nothing but the worn leather upholstery and the seatbelt hanging loose against the door frame. I stayed where I was for a long moment, crouched on the cold gravel, my chest heaving, my eyes scanning every shadow in the yard, every dark corner where she might have gone, refusing to believe so easily that she had simply vanished. I finally forced myself to my feet and backed slowly toward the house, never fully turning my back on the car, climbing the porch steps with my eyes still fixed on the empty driveway behind me. I pounded on my brother's door until he answered, bleary-eyed and confused, and I do not fully remember what I said to him in that first incoherent rush of words, only that he pulled me inside and locked the door behind us, and that I spent the rest of that night sitting upright in his living room, every light in the house turned on, unable to close my eyes for even a moment. It has been 3 months since that night, and I have not driven down Route 9 again, and do not intend to for as long as I live. I sold the car within the week, telling the buyer some half-true story about wanting something newer, unable to explain the real reason I could not stand to sit in that driver's seat for even a moment longer than necessary. Most nights, I am able to convince myself it is over, that whatever followed me into my brother's driveway that night has been left behind for good. But some nights, when I happen to glance into a mirror at just the wrong angle, in just the wrong light, I catch the faintest impression of white at the very edge of my vision, and I find myself unable to turn around and look directly behind me, terrified of exactly what I might find sitting there, patient, still waiting. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you'd like more, go ahead and subscribe. I try to make a few videos a day. See you in the next one.